Thank you, Jane. And thank you all for being here today, for spreading out in our sanctuary, making this work. When we thought about this service, the first thing that came to mind was the first principle that we talked about with our kids outside. The inherent worth and dignity of every human being. That we affirm and promote that. If you were like me, you may have trouble remembering the principles every once in a while. There's quite a few of them. Some of them have lots of words. It can be easy to overlook that fundamental idea that is the basis of any kind of shared theology that UUs have, starting with the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. But because we don't recite them every week, or we may not look at them as the first thing in the morning, we put up our principles around our sanctuary as one way of reminding me and us, in a very simple way, of trying to center those ideas. Because it's easy to overlook, not because we don't affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity, but because we do. We say we do. We say it a lot. And sometimes when something becomes so commonplace, it's easy to forget the revolutionary and the radical in it. So as a tradition that draws from multiple sources of inspiration, the hope has always been that we might bring out the best in ourselves and the best from those religious traditions. From the direct experience of the transcendent wonder and mystery, to meditative and contemplative practices, to Abrahamic faiths, moral courage from humanism, earth-centered worship styles that recognize the holy all around us, they ground us and direct us towards love. That is the great hope of Unitarian Universalism. But it all starts on that fundamental premise that everyone has an inherent worth and dignity that is not bestowed by who you look, what you look like, where you came from, what language you speak, but is something fundamental to us. So, for those of us who have been here for a while and have heard us talk about the first principle often, I want you to close your eyes with me, here in the sanctuary and at home. And I want you to imagine something, or remember something. To remember a time when walking through the doors of a church, or a synagogue, or a temple, any house of worship, when that was a scary, scary thing, because of what you look like, or whom you love, or how you identify, or pray, or don't pray. I want you to remember a time if that was you, or to imagine what that might feel like if that has never been you. And if you're in a memory, I invite you to call up what made you feel welcomed. If you're imagining, what would make you feel welcomed? I think when it comes down to it, for me, what makes us feel welcomed is when we feel centered, when we feel paid attention to, when we feel special or connected, when we think that someone is speaking directly to us in a sermon, in a hymn, in a prayer, in a handshake afterwards. That we are made to feel special or help to remember our specialness when we've forgotten it. When someone tells us there's something wrong with us because of what we look like or whom we love. Or it might be because what we see as centered as someone who represents us, or something who represents us. Someone who looks like, sounds like, speaks to me. It's like a piece of me is up here. Valerie Carr, in her book, See No Stranger, relates a prayer from her tradition of Sikhism. Words that translated say, "You are a part of me I don't yet know. You are a part of me I don't yet know." She talks about revolutionary love as an antidote for all the hurts and the poor policies and the death-dealing laws that Steve mentioned earlier. That healing the world begins with this idea of revolutionary love that is grounded, she doesn't use these words, but I read between the lines, in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. So we as UUs, right, we know this. We talk about this all the time. It's the other people that have the problem. It's very easy to overlook when we don't always live up to in honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, because that's actually really hard. I struggle with this a lot, and I often think to myself, well, if that was really true for me, every time I pass an unhoused person, when I make the corner by the airport, by the new Wawa, walking through this neighborhood, every time I walk by any person, what am I committed to do? I think at the very least it's to look them in the eye and say hello. But sometimes when I'm walking, I've got places to be, right? That doesn't make me a bad person. It lifts up how hard it is to live with revolutionary love centered in our minds. And to be reminded, every single person that you see, important, important, important. That you are a part of me I don't yet know. When I think of the way I talk with my family and my best friends, I think most often I do treat them like a part of me. Oh man, it's kind of exhausting, right? When we started to see ourselves in Unitarian Universalism as multiracial, multi-faith, multicultural, and to not just think of ourselves as kind of the old tradition, right, of this mainly Protestant Christian, but also moving into secular humanism, this very old kind of one idea, right, that's happened over the past, 30 to 50 years or so. And that was a shift. But when we start to think of ourselves as more than just what I look like, or what each of us as individuals look like, when we start to think of ourselves as a we that looks and sounds differently, that comes from different traditions, then all things become possible to start this revolutionary love process. So if you've heard about the Welcoming Congregation program in the UUA and you think, oh, we've done that, we did it before, we know. If you've heard someone talk about the UU principles before, you might think it might be what was called frivolous amusement back in Octavius Cato's day. Octavius spent a lot of time and energy on the Pythians, lifting up this black baseball team. And some of our Quaker friends from back in the day, some of our Christian friends from back in the day, who were on board with the mission for social justice and racial equality and voting rights for black folks, said, why are we spending so much time on frivolous amusements like baseball when there are so many wrongs in the world? I sometimes feel that way. Why are we spending so much time on this when there's voter suppression, women's rights being stripped away, gun violence, massive wealth inequality, climate change. Why are we spending so much time on this? Cato's reasoning was, if you cannot be seen as equal on the baseball field, you cannot be seen as equal in the voting booth. That it starts in the smallest of things, and it builds from there. And that violence, in all forms, starts with the denial of the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. Violence that comes from guns, violence that comes from laws, violence that comes from words. And make no mistake about it, marginalizing people with our words can be a form of violence. I got a letter in the mail recently. I've talked about before my embracing of using my pronouns when I introduce myself, because the name McKinley is not always clear as to what my gender identity is, and I would have loved to have had that when I was often called she, her growing up, and how hurtful that was for an insecure boy from West Texas. It hasn't happened in a long time, but we did just recently get a letter addressed to Miss McKinley Sims, and I giggled, and I was like, oh man, if I'd had a chance, this wouldn't have happened. For me, as someone for whom it is almost impossible to be marginalized, the discomfort that I felt from that one little nick, you can imagine how other forms of violence take root. So as Valerie Carr says, the antidote for this is revolutionary love. She writes, love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving. A choice we make over and over again. A choice we make over and over again. Love as labor can be taught, modeled, practiced. This labor engages all our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger protects that which is loved. And when we think we have reached our limit, wonder is the act that returns us to love. Revolutionary love is the choice to labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves, in order to transform the world around us. It begins with wonder. You are a part of me I do not yet know. It's not a formal code or a prescription, but she calls it an orientation to life that is personal and political, sustained by joy. Sustained by joy. She says, loving only ourselves is escapism. Loving only our opponents is self-loathing. And loving only others is ineffective. But all three practices together make love revolutionary, and revolutionary love can only be practiced in community. As we go through the steps of recertifying ourselves as a welcoming congregation, something we're called to do each year, I can feel that it's tedious and it takes time, and I often wonder, do we really have to do this? Because don't people kind of know, right? But if you think back to a time when you've ever felt scared to walk into a place, not knowing how you would be treated, and then what made you feel welcomed, what made you feel like you were a part of the other people of the community, something that helped negate the violence of shame, of policy violence, of physical hurts. Returning to that over and over and over can be exhausting. And treating someone like they are a piece of us, endowed with inherent worth and dignity, it can be exhausting. But it is worth it. Because if we are not able to fully love ourselves, our opponents, or each other, then we're not really able to love. Not in the best ways. Not in the ways that repeals the shame and guilt of people telling us that we're not important, or that we don't matter as much as someone who looks or talks perhaps like me. Love that destroys the idea of separateness and transforms relationships and creates the capacity to heal the wounds of the world. Those that we cause and those caused by systems that inform and surround us. So as we lift up our LGBT population here, as we continue to harp on the inherent worth and dignity, you look around and you say, God, there's a lot of principles talk around here, and I don't know if I'm always comfortable with that. I'm a free thinker. Yeah. We have to use our free thinking to continue to be explicit and to remind ourselves what is at our core, what makes us a welcoming congregation, not just in our certification with the UUA, but how do we treat folks who walk through the door, who join us online. To be explicit about our open and affirming theology is the first step to doing the work in the world Steve has called for us to do, to continue pushing for rights for those disenfranchised because of the color of their skin or because of whom they love. So hear it now. Here in this place, we are open and affirming of genders and orientations, of whom you love, of how you worship, of what you look like, what your culture informs of you. And we ask that when you bring your full self to this space, you come ready to be transformed, not to be transformed into someone who looks and sounds like me, but to be transformed by the diversity around us. And if you have been here for a while, I ask that you come ready to be transformed by something new that comes into our midst. As Valerie Carr ends, the antidote to violence that affects persons of color in America affects all Americans. We live under the cloud of that violence. As long as we live in a society that enforces hierarchies of human value, where violence is often perpetuated by institutions of power, individual acts of love are not enough. We need to be part of movements that help us wonder, grieve, and fight together. And may we remember that all of that is powered by joy. This joy that I have, the world did not give it to me. The world did not give it, and the world cannot take it away. May we center that joy in our revolutionary love that calls us to welcome and affirm every human being. May that be so. Amen. Now we have special music from our restoration singers.